Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's actually not Wednesday when I'm recording this, but I'm going to be out of town at a conference this week for several days, so I'm recording this ahead of time. So it's actually Monday when I record it and Wednesday morning when you watch it. But anyway, I hope your morning is off to a good start. I'm in my outdoor office with a second cup of coffee. Over the last several weeks, I've been on these Wednesday mornings talking about what we find in the Bible when we open this book, what we find in it. And of course, we find the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we find epistles or letters, most of them written by the Apostle Paul. And then there is that strange animal that we call apocalyptic literature, primarily Revelation, but also in some parts in Isaiah, Daniel, a few chapters in the Gospels, but primarily Revelation. Then last week, the prophets, as we Christians regard them, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, all of those guys. And so today, staying in the Old Testament, amongst the various kinds of literature in the Bible, we have the law. The law, and your 50-cent seminary word for the day is Torah. Torah is a Hebrew word that means law or instruction. So we're looking at the law, the Torah. This term Torah really has two meanings. One is it refers to the first 5 books. The Torah refers to the first 5 books as a term for referring to them: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this term Torah also refers to the commandments that we find in the law. So the Torah refers to those 5 books, and it also refers to the actual commandments and statutes that are given there. Traditionally, the Torah, or law, is ascribed to Moses, and you will find references to that in the New Testament. Some, like Jesus, might say, and so what did Moses say? But as a matter, practically speaking, really speaking, it's hard to know the exact origins of the Torah. Maybe Moses had some hand in writing it, but we can't know for certain, and these books do bear evidence of having been compiled, edited over some period of time. So we have Torah, traditionally ascribed to Moses, and it refers to the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and also to the commands that are contained in them. A lot of what we read in the Torah may even read like history. We find the story in Genesis, the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then in Exodus we get the story of the deliverance of the Israelites out of Egypt. And within that part that it seems to be history, there's something a lot deeper going on there. It's not simply history, but in that part, there are the covenants. In the Torah, we find the first covenants, the covenant that God made with Abraham. I will make you the father of a great nation, and your descendants will be like the stars of the sky, all of that. And then the covenants that God made with Moses. So we find in the Torah the first covenants that God made with humanity. In the Torah, we find commandments, laws. So, let's reflect for just a minute on the various commands. There are, actually 613 commandments. Somebody took the time, and I have no idea how long it took him. Somebody took the time to count up all of the various commands in the law, and they came up with 613 of them. And so within the law there are 613 different individual commands, and of course the most famous of those are the 10 Commandments. And within those 613, for ages now, people have sort of divided them into two broad categories. The law. When we read through the commands and the commands there, and some of them seem to be like really weird. Like all this stuff about the kinds of animals you can eat and the kinds of animals you can't eat. And they seem to be so strange to us as modern Christians reading it. And then there are parts that are just that seem so applicable now. All the laws about immorality and murder and theft. And for ages now, people have differentiated these commands, these laws, into two different types. The moral law and the ceremonial law. And the ceremonial law is all about, that's all of the ritual cleanliness laws, all the ritual purity laws. What animals you can eat, the animals you can't eat, and they just seem to go on and on and on forever, and they really applied only to then, and their purpose was to set Israel aside, to mark Israel out as being different from the other surrounding nations. And then there's the moral law. And the moral law is what it sounds like. There are all sorts of commandments prohibiting murder and adultery, theft, witchcraft, sorcery, and commanding people to look after those who are less fortunate, identified primarily as the widows, orphans, and aliens in your midst. In other words, you've got to look after the people who cannot provide for themselves. Even commands relating to how to care for your neighbor's animals. All of this are moral law, and the moral law is still valid, even for us. None of us wants to say that, oh well, all the commands against murder don't count anymore. The commands against adultery don't count anymore. The commands to look after widows, orphans, and the aliens in your midst, we don't need to do with that anymore. The moral law is still valid, but the ceremonial law isn't valid for us as Christians. So what is the purpose for the law? Does the law save us? Can we be saved by obedience to the law? And the simple answer is no. That is ingrained into us as Christians that obedience to the law, for the first thing, it's impossible. None of us can live up to it. And secondly, that's not the purpose for the law. So, when we read all of these commands, and there are so many of them, what's the purpose for them? John Calvin, one of the great Protestant reformers, identified 3 purposes for the law. And the third one is really instructive for us as believers. He said that the first use of the law is to condemn. That the law highlights what sin is. The first use of the law is it highlights what sin is and it condemns it. And in doing so, it actually drives us towards grace. Second use of the law, to restrain evil, to restrain corruption. Sort of as a civic role. And then the third use of the law, which is most useful for us as believers, for us of any age. Third use of the law is timeless. We can look at the law and we can get an idea for what God's will is, what God's general will is. We cannot be saved by making a list of all the different laws. Like I said, there are 613 of them, and doing our dead level best to never break any of them. That's not going to cut it. But we can look at these laws and apply them to our lives, and apply them to the way we interact with others, and we can get an idea for how God would want us to live. We can get general principles that would guide how we live and instruct us. So the law can become a teacher for us, even if it is not something that must be obeyed to the letter in order to earn anything. Again, as Christians, we understand that we earn nothing from God, that anything we get from God is purely grace. But this law, the law does stand to give us sort of a window into what God's general will can be for our lives, what His general will is. If there are any portions of the law that I would commend for your reading, read the first few chapters of Exodus. God sees His people in bondage and speaks to Moses, calls Moses to free them. You can read, say, Genesis 12 through about 17, where God calls Abraham and makes His covenant and His promises with Abraham. In Leviticus chapters 17 through 26, there's what is called the Holiness Code, which is all about how we live. It's all about how we, as children of God, live. What our lives should look like. And in, say, Deuteronomy 26, 27, 28, 29, and there are the various stipulations of the covenant. God says, here's how I'm going to bless you if you are obedient, and here's what will happen if you are not obedient. And that can be helpful for us because so much of the rest of the Old Testament is simply a reflection on how they had failed to live up to the covenant that God had given them. So with that is the law. The first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, plus also the commands that we find in those books. The law, some of it ceremonial, which really applies to then, but doesn't have application to us as Christians. But then there's the moral law, which is still valid and enforced to give us an idea for what the will of God is. And with that, with the law, sometime take a few minutes to read some parts of it. Like I said, particularly look at the Holiness Code. Look at those last several chapters of Deuteronomy. Some of the law is sort of dull. Yeah, there's numbers can get sort of dry, but there's some really wonderful stuff in the law. And I will mention this, that our cousins in the Jewish faith, our Jewish kin, when they grouped the books of their scriptures, our Old Testament, by the way, Jewish scriptures and our Old Testament are exactly the same. When they group their books of the Old Testament, their scriptures, the Torah comes first and is most important. The Torah is most important. And then there's this big chunk of material called the prophets. And then there are the writings. And for us, it's the same thing. Those first 5 books in the Old Testament, that's the law. That's maybe first among equals. So don't just chunk all of the law. Well, we don't need to worry about that anymore. There's stuff in here that is very instructive for us even now. Stuff that is very useful for us to read. And so sometime take a few minutes and read about Abraham, read about Moses, read the Holiness Code. So with that, have a great rest of your Wednesday.